Alarms tore through my ship before I even opened my eyes. Red light spilled across the cabin walls, pulsing like something alive. I was thrown sideways as the hull groaned under pressure, and for one terrifying second I thought we were going to break apart in open space. "Report," I shouted, gripping the edge of my console so hard my knuckles ached. "Debris field," came the voice of my navigator, tight and fast. "We dropped out of the jump too close to a collapsed station. Hold on." I did not need to be told twice. My hands moved across the controls on instinct, years of training taking over where fear tried to creep in. The ship rolled hard to the left, metal shrieking somewhere behind me as a piece of wreckage scraped along our shields. Every warning light on my console lit up at once, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding louder than the alarms. We had been chasing this signal for 6 days straight, jumping from one dead system to another, following a trail that should not have existed. And now, in the middle of dodging the twisted remains of some long-forgotten station, my scanner chimed with a sound I had not heard in years. A confirmation tone, clean, steady, and unmistakable. "Belay that turn," I said suddenly. "Hold this heading." "Vecker, we are still inside the debris field." "I know where we are," I said, my eyes locked on the small blinking dot now steady on my screen. "I need 30 seconds. 30 seconds felt like an eternity, as another chunk of metal spun past our forward window, close enough that I could see old markings on its surface, symbols from a language nobody in the Concord had spoken in centuries. My chest was tight, my breathing was shallow, but my eyes never left that blinking dot. There it was, the signal, the one thing every ship in the Ashen Concord had been built, trained, and sent out to find. Not weapons, not resources, not new worlds to settle, just this one signal, buried for longer than anyone alive could remember, hiding somewhere out among 100,000 stars. I had heard the stories since I was young enough to still believe every one of them. My mother used to lower her voice whenever she spoke about the Ember War, as if saying it too loudly might wake something that was better left sleeping. She told me about the being who ended that war alone, who stood against forces our ancestors could not defeat, and who never once seemed to care about the cost. She told me our people ran not because we lost, but because we were afraid of what would happen if we ever won. I never fully believed her, not until this moment, staring at a signal that matched patterns buried so deep in our archives that most historians thought they were myths, invented to frighten children. "Vecker, the field is closing," my navigator warned, voice edged with panic now. "We need to move." "Copy that. Give me full power to the rear thrusters on my mark." The ship shuddered as something struck our shields again, harder this time. Sparks burst from a panel near my feet, and the emergency lights flickered before steadying. I forced my focus back onto the console, watching numbers climb and fall as our systems fought to keep us stable. "Mark," I said, and the ship lurched forward with a violent burst of speed, throwing me back into my seat. The debris field blurred past on either side of us, chunks of broken hull and twisted metal spinning silently in the dark. For a moment, I was certain we would not make it through, that after everything, after years of chasing rumors and half-broken records, this was how it would end, crushed between the remains of a station nobody remembered building. Then, as suddenly as it began, we were clear. The ship steadied, the alarms cut off one by one until the only sound left was my own ragged breathing and the quiet hum of the engines settling back into a normal rhythm. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the black emptiness of space in front of me, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline still rushing through my body. Beside me, my navigator let out a breath so heavy it sounded almost like a laugh. "That was too close," she said. "Too close is still alive," I answered, though my voice came out quieter than I meant it to. I turned my attention back to the console, back to that steady, blinking dot that had somehow survived a debris field crossing without so much as a flicker of interference. I zoomed the display in, watching as coordinates locked into place. A small blue planet, unremarkable in almost every way. No large cities glowing on the night side. No orbital defenses. No fleets waiting in ambush. Just a quiet world circling a quiet star. The kind of place most scouts would fly past without a second glance. And yet, right there, in the middle of a wide green field on the edge of what looked like farmland, was a single life signature pulsing in perfect rhythm, with the ancient signal pattern our people had spent 3,000 years trying to trace. I stared at it until my eyes started to hurt. "Is that her?" my navigator asked quietly, leaning over my shoulder. I did not answer right away. I could not. Everything I had ever learned about the Ember War rushed through my mind at once. Every warning, every legend, every story told in hushed voices around dim lights late at night. I thought about the statues built not to honor her, but to remind us never to provoke whatever it was she represented. I thought about the sealed vaults in our home system, weapons locked away and forbidden to be used against anything except her, should she ever be found. And now, after everything, she had been found. "Send the coordinates to Fleet Command," I finally said. "Encrypted channel only. No open broadcasts." "You think someone is listening?" "I think if this is real, everyone is listening," I said. Every scout ship, every research vessel, every long-range station across a dozen systems has probably picked up traces of this exact signal at some point. We got lucky. We got here first. My navigator nodded slowly, her fingers already moving across her own console to prepare the transmission. I watched the numbers tick upward as the encrypted message compiled, thinking about what would happen the moment Fleet Command received it. I thought about the countless briefings I had sat through as a cadet, listening to officers explain evacuation procedures that existed for exactly one purpose, in case she was ever found and things went badly. I thought about my mother's voice again, low and careful, telling me stories she swore were true even when everyone else dismissed them as legend. She did not conquer worlds, she used to say. She simply refused to stop. I never understood what that meant. Not fully, not until years later, sitting in this chair, staring at a small blinking light on a quiet, unremarkable planet that had somehow hidden the most feared name in our history in plain sight. "Transmission sent," my navigator said softly. I let out a slow breath, watching the stars outside our window shift slightly as the ship adjusted its course, holding position at a safe distance from the planet below. My orders were clear the moment Fleet Command responded. Maintain observation. Do not engage. Do not approach. Wait for further instruction. I intended to follow every single one of those orders. But even as I sat there, watching that quiet blue world turn slowly beneath us, I could not shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen next was going to change everything I thought I understood about my own people, about the wars we fought, and about the fear we carried across every star system we had ever crossed. The scanner blinked again, steady and calm, completely unaware of the storm it was about to unleash across 1,000 worlds. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on that quiet green field far below, and for the first time since I had joined this mission, I felt something colder than fear settle into my chest. I felt certainty. We had found her. The hours that followed passed strangely for me. I did not sleep, even though my navigator eventually retreated to her quarters, exhausted from the encounter in the debris field. I stayed at my console, watching the planet rotate slowly beneath us, watching that single life signature move occasionally within a small radius near the farmhouse, never straying far, never showing any sign that it knew it had just been discovered by a ship carrying the weight of an entire species' fear. I tried to imagine what she might look like. The old records were inconsistent, some describing a towering figure wrapped in light, others describing something far more ordinary, almost disappointingly plain. I had always assumed the exaggerated versions were closer to the truth. After all, nothing ordinary could have ended the Ember War the way the stories described. At some point, a reply came through from Fleet Command, short and direct. Confirmed reception of coordinates. Full council convening within the hour. Maintain position and observation. Do not attempt contact under any circumstances. I read the message twice, then a third time, feeling the seriousness of it settle over me like a heavy blanket. A full council meeting meant every high-ranking official across the Concord would be involved within hours. It meant fleets would begin moving. It meant the quiet, uneventful life this small blue planet had known for however many years was about to end. I looked back at the view screen, at the gentle curve of clouds drifting across green and blue, and felt an unexpected pang of guilt settle in my chest. Whatever waited down there, whoever she truly was, she had no idea what was coming. I thought about warning her. The thought crossed my mind more than once as I sat alone in the quiet hum of the cockpit. I dismissed it almost as quickly as it appeared. My orders were clear. My duty was clear. Whatever fear my people carried about her, whatever legends had been passed down through generations, none of it mattered as much as I once believed it should. Not yet, anyway. I set my scanner to continuous recording, capturing every subtle detail I could from a safe distance. Weather patterns, small movements near the farmhouse, occasional flickers of light in the windows as the sun set slowly over the quiet fields below. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it matched the terrifying descriptions carved into ancient texts back home. And yet the signal never wavered. It matched every pattern our historians had cataloged for centuries, every fragment of data pulled from broken records left behind after the Ember War ended. There was no mistake, no error in calibration, no chance this was simply an unrelated anomaly. She was real. I sat in silence for a long while, watching the planet turn beneath me, feeling the weight of history pressing down on my shoulders. Somewhere far above me, Fleet Command was already preparing a response that would shake the foundations of everything my people believed about strength, about fear, and about the legend that had haunted us across 3,000 years and countless star systems. And somewhere far below me, on a quiet world with green fields and a single farmhouse, she simply existed, unaware that an entire civilization had just found her. I did not know yet how this would end. I did not know how many ships would eventually arrive in orbit above that peaceful little world, or how quickly the calm evening I was watching would shatter into something far larger than any of us were prepared for. All I knew, sitting there in the quiet hum of my ship, staring at that small, unwavering signal, was that everything was about to change. And somehow, deep down, I already suspected that nothing about what came next would happen the way any of us expected. The council chamber went silent the moment the coordinates appeared on the main display. I was not physically present, only patched in through a secure channel from my ship, but I could feel the tension even through the static of the connection. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Nobody even seemed to breathe. General Draven Kesh was the first to break the silence, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow made the moment feel even more dangerous. Confirm the pattern match. I want 3 independent verifications before we act on anything. Already done, sir, came a voice from somewhere off-screen. 3 separate systems confirmed the signature. It matches the archived data from the Ember War with 99% accuracy. Another silence followed, longer this time. I watched through my display as officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging glances, others staring blankly at the small blue planet now highlighted on the star map in the center of the room. Then it is true, someone finally whispered. I sat alone in my cockpit, listening to the conversation unfold, feeling strangely disconnected from what was happening even though I was the one who had found her. Within minutes, orders began flying across every channel. Fleet deployments, emergency briefings. Historians pulled from research stations across a dozen systems, all converging toward a single destination none of them had ever expected to actually reach. I had grown up hearing about our fleet's strength, about the ships built specifically in case this day ever came. I never imagined I would be the one watching it all mobilize in real time from the front seat. Within 2 days, the space around my ship was no longer empty. Ship after ship dropped out of jump, filling the black emptiness with hulls of every size and purpose. Warships bristling with weapon systems I had only seen in training simulations. Massive command vessels carrying entire divisions of soldiers, smaller scout ships like mine, gathering at the edges, watching everything unfold with the same disbelief I felt. I stood at my viewport one evening, staring out at the growing armada surrounding that small, quiet planet, and felt something heavy settle in my chest. It did not feel like triumph, it felt closer to dread. You would think we were preparing to face an entire empire, my navigator said quietly, standing beside me. In a way, I said, I think that is exactly what we believe we are facing. General Kesh's flagship arrived on the 3rd day, a massive vessel unlike anything I had seen outside of historical records. It moved slowly into position at the center of the fleet, surrounded by an escort of smaller ships, each one prepared to defend it at a moment's notice. I watched it settle into orbit above the planet, its shadow falling briefly across our own smaller ship as it passed. Shortly after, I received new orders. Report aboard the flagship immediately for a full briefing. I left my ship with a strange mixture of pride and fear twisting together in my stomach. As the shuttle carried me toward the massive vessel, I looked out at the endless rows of warships, stretching in every direction, thousands of them, each one carrying crews who had spent their entire lives training for a threat most of them never believed was real. The interior of the flagship was just as imposing as its exterior. Long metal corridors stretched in every direction, filled with officers moving briskly from one station to another, voices low and urgent. I was led through several checkpoints before finally arriving at the central briefing hall, where dozens of high-ranking officials were already gathered around a massive holographic display of the planet below. General Kesh stood near the center, arms crossed, studying the display with an intensity that made the room feel even heavier than it already did. Scout Vecker, he said without turning around, you are the one who found her. Yes, sir. Then you understand better than most what is at stake here. I did not answer right away. The truth was, I understood less than I wanted to admit. I had grown up on stories, on warnings passed down through generations, but standing in that room, surrounded by officers preparing for what many believed could be the most important encounter in our history, I realized how little any of us truly knew. "Sir, if I may ask," I said carefully, "what exactly is the plan?" General Kesh finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "The plan," he said slowly, "is to proceed with more caution than we have ever shown toward anything in our history. We are not here to provoke her. We are here to understand what we are dealing with, and to prepare accordingly." Around the room, historians pulled up old records, fragments of data recovered from the Ember War, most of it damaged or incomplete after thousands of years. I watched as images flickered across smaller displays, blurred and distorted, showing glimpses of a war none of us had lived through but all of us had been raised to fear. One historian, an older woman named Illyra, stepped forward to address the room. "Based on everything we have recovered," she began, "the Ember War ended not because of overwhelming force, but because of something we have never fully understood. Every account describes a being who simply would not stop, regardless of the cost, regardless of the odds." "Define stop," General Kesh said. Illyra hesitated. "That is the problem, General. We do not know. Every version of the story ends differently. Some say she pushed forward until the enemy simply had nothing left to fight with. Others say the enemy chose to end the conflict themselves, out of exhaustion rather than defeat. What remains consistent across every account is that she never once retreated, never once hesitated, and never once showed any sign of slowing down." The room fell quiet again. As everyone absorbed the weight of that statement, I found myself thinking back to my mother's stories, the ones she used to tell in hushed tones late at night. She never described a warrior wielding devastating power. She described someone who simply refused to give up, no matter what stood in her way. "So we are afraid," I said quietly, almost without meaning to speak aloud, not because she is strong, but because she does not stop. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I felt heat rise to my face, embarrassed at having spoken without thinking, but General Kesh did not look angry. If anything, he looked thoughtful, as if my words had settled something he had been turning over in his mind for a long time. "That may be the most accurate description anyone in this room has offered," he said finally. The briefing continued for hours after that, covering every possible contingency. Evacuation procedures for our home system, prepared decades ago and rehearsed regularly, though nobody in the room believed they would ever actually need them. Communication protocols designed to avoid any possible misunderstanding. Weapons systems locked away for generations, forbidden to be used except under the most extreme circumstances, now quietly moved into position aboard select vessels just in case. I listened to all of it with a growing sense of unease. Every plan, every protocol, every carefully rehearsed procedure seemed built around the assumption that first contact would go badly. Nobody in that room seemed to consider the possibility that it might not. Near the end of the briefing, General Kesh addressed the room directly. "We will send a small delegation to the surface, non-combative, observational only. Their purpose is to make contact, gather information, and report back before any further action is taken." My stomach tightened as I realized what was coming next. "Scout Vecker," he said, turning toward me, "you found her. You will lead the delegation." I opened my mouth to respond, though I was not entirely certain what I intended to say. Every instinct in my body wanted to refuse, to explain that I was a scout, not a diplomat, that I had spent my career avoiding contact rather than initiating it. But something in General Kesh's expression told me this was not a request. "Understood, sir," I said instead, my voice steadier than I felt. The room began to clear soon after, officers moving off to prepare their respective divisions for whatever came next. I remained standing near the center of the hall, staring at the holographic display of the planet below, watching the small marker that represented her location, steady and unmoving near that quiet farmhouse. Illyra approached me quietly as the room emptied. "You seem troubled," she said. "I am about to walk toward the single most feared being in our history," I said, with nothing but a translator and a request for peaceful conversation. "I think troubled is an understatement." She offered a faint, knowing smile. "Perhaps," she said, "but consider this. In 3,000 years of stories, warnings, and legends, nobody has ever actually tried simply speaking with her." I turned that thought over in my mind long after she walked away, standing alone in the quiet hall, as the enormity of what waited for me the following day settled fully into place. That night I returned to my ship and sat by the viewport for a long while, watching the fleet stretch endlessly in every direction around that small, unremarkable planet. Thousands of ships, thousands of soldiers, an entire civilization holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when someone finally worked up the courage to walk up to the door of a legend and knock. I thought about my mother again, about the way her voice used to soften whenever she told these stories, as if some part of her respected the being she was warning me about, even as she taught me to fear her. I did not sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the small farmhouse, about the quiet fields surrounding it, about the single life signature that had remained steady and calm through all of this, completely unaware of the storm gathering above. Tomorrow, I would walk down there myself. Tomorrow, I would finally learn whether 3,000 years of fear had ever truly been necessary at all. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I was certain the others walking beside me could hear it. The shuttle ride down to the surface had been silent. Every member of the delegation lost in their own private thoughts, none of us willing to say aloud what we all secretly feared might happen the moment we landed. We touched down at the edge of a wide field, far enough from the farmhouse to avoid startling anyone, though I doubted anything short of the entire sky filling with ships could startle whoever waited inside that quiet building. I stepped out first, my boots sinking slightly into soft green grass still damp from an early morning rain. The air smelled clean, almost sweet, nothing like the recycled atmosphere I had grown used to aboard my ship. Behind me, 4 other members of the delegation followed, each one selected specifically for this mission. Elira walked just behind my left shoulder, her expression calm despite the tension radiating off everyone else. 2 soldiers flanked us on either side, their weapons lowered but ready, following strict orders to use them only if absolutely necessary. The last member of our group carried recording equipment, tasked with documenting everything that happened, regardless of outcome. Above us, though invisible to the naked eye, I knew the entire fleet was watching. Every camera, every sensor, every recording device aboard those thousands of ships had been focused on this single field since the moment our shuttle left the flagship. Somewhere far above, General Kesh and the full council were watching this unfold in real time, waiting to see whether their careful planning would hold or collapse the moment we made contact. I forced myself to keep walking, one slow step after another, my eyes fixed on the farmhouse growing larger ahead of us. It looked exactly like it had in our scans, small and simple, with faded wooden walls and a sloped roof that had clearly seen better days. A tire swing hung motionless from a large tree near the side of the house, its rope worn thin from years of use. An old wooden fence bordered the edge of the field, several planks missing or hanging loose. None of it matched the imagery burned into my mind since childhood. No towering fortress, no visible defenses, no sign whatsoever that anything extraordinary lived within those walls. "This does not feel right," one of the soldiers muttered quietly beside me. "Stay focused," I said, though I privately agreed with him. As we crossed the last stretch of open field, a dog suddenly appeared from around the side of the house, barking sharply twice before falling silent, watching us with cautious brown eyes. My hand instinctively moved toward my weapon before I caught myself, feeling a strange flush of embarrassment at how quickly instinct had taken over. The dog did not attack. It simply sat down near the porch steps, tail wagging slowly, watching us approach with mild curiosity rather than aggression. I glanced sideways at Elira, who offered a small, reassuring nod, though I could see the same nervous energy in her eyes that I felt twisting through my own chest. We stopped roughly 10 paces from the porch, close enough to be heard, far enough according to protocol to allow for a hasty retreat if necessary, though I doubted retreat would matter much against whoever, or whatever, waited inside. I raised my hand slowly, activating my translator, and cleared my throat, though my voice still came out quieter than I intended. "Hello," I called out, the word feeling strange and inadequate given the weight of everything leading up to this moment. "We mean no harm, we wish only to speak." For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the gentle rustle of wind moving through the tall grass around us, and the quiet creak of the tire swing swaying slightly on its rope. I felt sweat forming along the back of my neck despite the cool morning air. Then, slowly, the front door creaked open. I do not know exactly what I expected to see in that doorway. Some part of me, despite every rational thought telling me otherwise, still half expected something enormous, something radiating power and menace exactly as the old legends described. My training told me to expect anything. My instincts told me to be ready for the worst. Instead, a small figure stepped out onto the porch. She was shorter than I was by a considerable amount, with silver hair pulled back loosely and lines etched deeply into her face, the kind that come only after many, many years of living. She wore a simple knitted garment over her shoulders, faded and worn at the edges, and a pair of soft shoes that looked far more suited for walking through a garden than facing down an alien delegation. She stopped at the top of the porch steps and looked out at us, her expression unreadable at first. Then her gaze lifted, moving slowly past our small group, past the field, up toward the sky itself, where I knew, even if she could not fully see them, thousands of ships hung silently in orbit above her quiet little world. She stood there for a long moment, studying the sky the way someone might study storm clouds gathering on the horizon, calculating whether they needed to bring in the laundry before the rain started. I held my breath, waiting. "That is a lot of ships," she said finally, her voice calm, almost conversational, carrying none of the fear or aggression I had braced myself for. I did not know how to respond. Beside me, I heard Alira let out a small, startled breath, as if she too had been expecting something entirely different. "We apologize for the intrusion," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "We have traveled a great distance to find you." She studied me for a moment, her sharp eyes moving slowly over my unfamiliar features, taking in every detail without any visible sign of alarm. Then, almost to my disbelief, the corner of her mouth twitched upward into something that looked remarkably like amusement. "Well," she said, glancing briefly back at the dog now lying calmly near her feet, "you found me." I stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. Every scenario I had rehearsed during the long, sleepless night before this mission had assumed some form of confrontation, some display of the terrifying power our ancestors had fled from so long ago. Nothing in my training had prepared me for this quiet, almost mundane response. "We come representing the Ashen Concord," I said carefully, trying to remember the careful wording I had practiced for hours the night before. "Our people have long histories tied to events long ago, events involving a great conflict known to us as the Ember War." Her expression shifted slightly at the mention of the name, something flickering behind her eyes that I could not quite identify. Not fear, not anger, something closer to weariness, the kind that comes from carrying a memory far heavier than anyone around her could possibly understand. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "For us, it has shaped 3,000 years of history," I said. "Our people have built entire traditions around the events of that war, around the stories passed down about the one who ended it." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting somewhere far past us, past the field, past the fence, toward memories none of us could see. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain still lingering from earlier that morning. "I did not end anything," she finally said, her voice softer now, almost distant. "I just refused to leave." I glanced at Alira, who was watching the exchange with intense focus, clearly cataloging every word for the historians waiting anxiously back aboard the flagship. I turned my attention back to the woman standing calmly on her porch, feeling the weight of 3,000 years of fear pressing down on my shoulders, colliding uncomfortably with the quiet, almost ordinary figure standing in front of me. "May we speak with you further?" I asked. "We have traveled a long way, and there is much our people wish to understand." She studied me for another long moment, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the request. Behind her, I could see the interior of the small house through the open door, simple furniture, faded curtains, the kind of modest life that seemed impossibly ordinary given everything I had been taught to expect. Finally, she let out a small sigh, glancing briefly back up at the sky where the fleet remained hidden from plain sight but undeniably present. "You crossed the galaxy for this," she said, more to herself than to us, shaking her head slightly with something that almost resembled disbelief. "All right then." She turned, walked slowly down the porch steps, crossed the short distance to where an old wooden bench sat beneath the shade of the large tree, and lowered herself down onto it with a quiet, unhurried motion, as though the arrival of an entire alien armada above her home was little more than a minor inconvenience in an otherwise ordinary day. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at her, at the sheer disconnect between the legend I had grown up fearing and the small, tired figure now sitting calmly beneath a tree, waiting patiently for us to join her. Behind me, I heard one of the soldiers whisper something under his breath, though I could not quite make out the words. I did not blame him. I was struggling to process the moment myself. She looked up at us, patting the empty space on the bench beside her with a casual, almost welcoming gesture. "Well," she said, "are you going to stand there all day, or are you going to sit down and tell me exactly why half your fleet thought I needed this much attention?" I exchanged a glance with Alira, who gave a small, encouraging nod, and slowly, carefully, I stepped forward and lowered myself onto the bench beside the single most feared figure in my people's entire history. She simply sat there, calm and unbothered, waiting for me to speak, as if the weight of 3,000 years of fear meant absolutely nothing to her at all. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. broken only by the soft rustle of leaves above, and the occasional distant bark from the dog now wandering somewhere near the fence line. I sat stiffly on the wooden bench, painfully aware of every soldier standing behind me, every camera recording this moment for a fleet full of officials watching with held breath. "You have a name?" she asked finally, turning her sharp eyes toward me. "Vecker," I said. "Vecker Corin." "Margaret," she replied simply, extending a weathered hand toward me. "Margaret Doyle." I stared at her hand for a moment, uncertain of the correct response, before carefully reaching out and shaking it, feeling oddly formal given the strangeness of the entire situation. Her grip was firm despite her age, steady in a way that somehow unsettled me more than any display of power could have. "I imagine you have questions," she said, leaning back against the bench, folding her hands calmly in her lap. "More than I know how to ask," I admitted. She let out a small, quiet laugh, though there was no mockery in it, only a tired sort of amusement. That seems to be the theme of the day. I glanced back at Alira, who gave a small nod of encouragement, silently urging me to continue. I took a slow breath, trying to steady my thoughts before speaking again. "Our records describe the Ember War as one of the most devastating conflicts our people have ever known," I said carefully. "They describe you as the one who ended it. A being of immense power, capable of standing alone against forces no army could withstand." Margaret's expression shifted slightly, something heavy settling behind her eyes as she looked out over the quiet field stretching before us. "That is one way to tell it," she said softly. "Is it not true?" She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Power had very little to do with it," she said finally. "Everyone else who could have stopped that war had already given up. Soldiers on every side, human and otherwise, had stopped believing it would ever end. They fought because they did not know how to stop, not because they believed there was still a reason to keep fighting." I listened carefully, absorbing every word, aware of the recording device capturing every syllable for historians waiting anxiously back aboard the fleet. "I was not the strongest person there," she continued. "I was not even close to it. But I was the last one who refused to leave the field, even when everyone around me told me it was pointless to keep going. I kept moving forward, not because I believed I could win, but because I could not bring myself to walk away while there was still even the smallest chance things could change." "And the enemy?" I asked quietly. "What became of them?" Margaret's gaze softened, something almost sorrowful passing behind her eyes. "Eventually they stopped too," she said. "Not because I defeated them, not because I destroyed anything. They simply reached a point where they could not justify continuing a war that had already cost so much, against someone who clearly was not going to give them the satisfaction of watching her quit." I sat in stunned silence, turning her words over in my mind, comparing them against every legend, every warning, every carefully preserved account passed down through generations of my people. None of it matched the terrifying image we had built around her. None of it matched the fear that had shaped 3,000 years of history. "Our people fled," I said slowly. "After the war ended, they left this part of the galaxy entirely, believing you represented a threat too dangerous to remain near." Margaret's expression flickered with something between surprise and quiet sadness. "I did not know that," she admitted. "I assumed everyone simply moved on with their lives, the way people do after a war ends." "They built an entire fleet," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the sky above us. "An entire civilization prepared, for generations, for the day they might have to face you again." She looked up at the sky then, studying it the way she had when we first arrived, her expression unreadable. "All this," she said softly, "because I refused to stop fighting a war I never wanted to be part of in the first place." The weight of her words settled heavily over the small group gathered around the bench. I glanced at Alira, whose expression had shifted from professional curiosity to something closer to quiet disbelief, as if she too were struggling to reconcile the legend she had studied her entire career with the tired, ordinary woman sitting calmly in front of us. "May I ask something?" Margaret said after a long pause. "Of course." "Why now?" she asked. "Why, after 3,000 years, did your people finally decide to come looking for me?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer honestly without revealing too much about the fear that had driven this mission from the very beginning. "Our historians believed you still existed somewhere among the stars," I said carefully. "Some believed you represented an unresolved threat that needed to be understood, or perhaps contained, before it could resurface unexpectedly." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, though her expression remained calm. "You built an entire armada," she said slowly, "to come find one old woman living alone on a quiet little farm, just in case she decided to start another war. When she put it that way, The absurdity of the situation settled over me with uncomfortable clarity. I glanced back at the soldiers standing rigidly behind me, weapons still lowered but ready, and suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of embarrassment at the sheer scale of the response our people had mobilized against this small, unassuming figure. "I suppose, when you put it like that," I said slowly, "it does sound somewhat excessive." Margaret let out a genuine laugh this time, warm and unguarded, the sound carrying easily across the quiet field. "Somewhat," she agreed, shaking her head slightly. "I have not held a weapon in longer than I care to remember. I spend my days tending this garden, walking that dog, and occasionally complaining about the weather, hardly the stuff of nightmares." I found myself smiling slightly despite the seriousness of the situation, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly for the first time since we had landed. "Our stories painted a very different picture," I admitted. "Stories often do," she said simply. "Fear has a way of growing larger with every retelling, until eventually it stops resembling the truth entirely." I thought about my mother's voice again, soft and careful, describing a being of immense and terrifying power. I thought about the statues built across our home system, not to honor Margaret, but to serve as a permanent warning against provoking whatever she represented. I thought about the countless briefings, the emergency protocols, the weapons locked away for generations, all built around a fear that, standing here now, seemed almost impossibly disconnected from the reality sitting quietly beside me. "Would you be willing to speak with our council directly?" I asked carefully. "There is much they wish to understand, and I believe your perspective could change a great deal about how our people view the events of that war." Margaret considered the request for a long moment, glancing briefly toward the sky, then back toward her quiet little farmhouse, as if weighing the peaceful simplicity of her current life against the weight of what such a conversation might bring. "I suppose I owe your people at least that much," she said finally. 3,000 years of fear deserves a proper explanation, even if it is a rather unglamorous one. Relief washed over me, though it was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of nervous energy at the thought of arranging a formal conversation between Margaret and the full council waiting anxiously above us. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "I know this cannot be easy, having your quiet life interrupted so abruptly." Margaret offered a small, tired smile, glancing affectionately toward the dog now curled up near her feet. "It has been a long time since anyone asked me about the war," she said quietly. "Perhaps it is time someone finally heard the truth instead of another exaggerated legend." She rose slowly from the bench, brushing off her worn cardigan, before turning to look at each of us gathered around her small, unassuming home. "Would anyone care for some tea before we discuss anything further?" she asked, her tone shifting back to something warm and welcoming, almost as if the weight of the previous conversation had never happened at all. I glanced at Alira, who gave a small, amused nod, clearly just as stunned as I was by the sudden shift in tone. Behind us, I heard one of the soldiers let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh, quickly stifled behind a cough. "Tea would be appreciated," I said finally, unable to fully hide the small smile forming at the corner of my mouth. Margaret nodded approvingly, turning to make her way back toward the farmhouse, her dog trotting happily along beside her. I remained seated on the bench for a moment longer, staring up at the quiet sky above, knowing that somewhere far beyond what my eyes could see, an entire fleet was waiting anxiously to hear what had just unfolded on this small, unremarkable field. 3,000 years of fear, I thought quietly to myself, and it all led here. To tea, and an old woman with a tired smile, and a dog who had barked only once before deciding we were not worth the trouble. I rose slowly from the bench and followed her toward the farmhouse, feeling, for the first time since this mission began, that perhaps everything we had been taught to fear was about to be rewritten entirely. The inside of the farmhouse was smaller than I expected, though warmer in a way that surprised me. Sunlight filtered through faded curtains, casting soft patterns across a worn wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Margaret moved about the small kitchen with practiced ease, filling an old kettle with water while the rest of us stood awkwardly near the doorway, uncertain where exactly protocol expected us to stand during something as unprecedented as this. Sit," she said, waving a hand toward the table without turning around. "I promise the chairs will not bite, unlike whatever you were expecting to find out there in that field." I exchanged a glance with Alira before carefully lowering myself into one of the chairs, the wood creaking slightly beneath me. The two soldiers remained standing near the door, clearly uncertain whether military protocol allowed them to sit down for tea with the single most feared figure in our people's history. Margaret glanced at them, raised an eyebrow, then gestured toward the empty chairs pointedly, until they too reluctantly took their seats. The kettle began to whistle softly after a few minutes, and Margaret poured the tea into a collection of chipped, mismatched cups, setting one carefully in front of each of us, before finally settling into her own chair at the head of the table. "Now," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Where were we?" "You were explaining the truth behind the Ember War," I said carefully. She nodded slowly, staring down into her tea for a long moment before speaking again. "The stories your people tell," she said, "make it sound as though I marched onto some grand battlefield and single-handedly turned the tide of history. That is not how it happened, not even close." "Then how did it happen?" Illyra asked gently, leaning forward slightly. Margaret was quiet for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the warm cup in her hands. "By the time I became involved," she said, "the war had already been raging for years. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict. Armies on both sides had lost so much that most had stopped fighting for victory. They fought simply because stopping felt impossible. Nobody wanted to be the side that gave up first, even when giving up would have saved countless lives." I listened carefully, absorbing every detail, aware of just how different this account was from anything recorded in our archives. "I was not a soldier," she continued. "Not originally. I was thrown into that conflict the same way countless others were, through circumstances entirely outside my control. But somewhere along the way, I made a decision that ended up defining the rest of my life. I decided I would not stop, regardless of what it cost me, until there was truly nothing left to fight for." "That sounds like exactly the kind of strength our legends describe," I said. Margaret shook her head slowly. "It was not strength," she said. "It was stubbornness. There is a difference, even if the outcome looks similar from a distance. I was terrified nearly every single day of that war. I made countless mistakes. I lost people I cared about deeply, people I could not save no matter how hard I tried. The only thing that set me apart from everyone else was that I refused to let any of that convince me to walk away." The room fell silent, except for the quiet ticking of an old clock somewhere near the far wall. I glanced at the recording device still capturing every word, knowing that historians back aboard the fleet would spend years studying this single conversation, rewriting doctrine that had stood unquestioned for 3,000 years. "Eventually," Margaret continued, "the other side simply could not sustain the fight any longer. Not because I destroyed them, not because I overwhelmed them with some incredible power. They ran out of reasons to keep fighting against someone who clearly was never going to give them the satisfaction of surrender. War, in the end, requires both sides to keep believing it is worth continuing. The moment one side stops believing that, the whole thing collapses under its own weight." I sat back slightly in my chair, turning her words over carefully in my mind. Everything I had been taught since childhood painted her as an overwhelming force, a being whose power alone had ended the conflict. The truth, as she described it, was far more human, far more relatable, and somehow far more unsettling in its own quiet way. "Why did nobody correct the record?" I asked. "Why let the legend grow so far beyond what actually happened?" Margaret offered a tired smile. "I did not know the legend had grown at all," she said. "After the war ended, I simply wanted to live a quiet life. I had no interest in correcting stories I never heard being told. I settled here, built this small home, and tried to leave that chapter of my life behind me." "And yet our people fled an entire region of space," I said quietly. "Convinced you represented a threat too dangerous to remain near." Margaret's expression softened, something like genuine regret passing behind her eyes. "I am sorry to hear that," she said. "I never intended for anyone to live in fear because of decisions I made during the worst years of my life. If I had known, perhaps I would have tried to find your people myself, to explain things properly before the story had a chance to grow into something so much larger than the truth." I thought about the statues built across our home system, the countless warnings passed down through generations, the emergency protocols rehearsed for decades in preparation for a threat that, as it turned out, had simply been living quietly on a small farm, tending a garden and complaining about the weather. "Our people built their entire understanding of strength around fear of what you represented," I said slowly, "around the idea that overwhelming power was the only thing capable of ending a war that size." "And now?" Margaret asked, studying me carefully. I considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "Now I think perhaps the lesson was never about power at all," I said. "Perhaps it was always about refusing to give up, even when everything around you insists that giving up is the only reasonable choice." Margaret smiled at that, a genuine, warm expression that reached all the way to her tired eyes. "That," she said, "is a lesson far more useful than anything your legends could have taught you." We sat together for a while longer after that, the conversation slowly shifting away from the weight of history and towards smaller, gentler topics. Margaret asked about our journey, about the ships waiting above, about what daily life looked like aboard vessels built to travel between stars. I found myself relaxing slightly as the conversation continued, the tension that had gripped my chest since the moment we landed, slowly beginning to ease. Eventually, Elira gently steered the conversation back toward the matter of speaking with the full council, and Margaret agreed once again, though with a small, tired sigh that suggested she was already anticipating just how much larger this conversation was about to become. "I suppose there is no putting it off any longer," she said, glancing toward the small window where sunlight had begun to shift into the golden hues of late afternoon. "If your council wishes to hear the truth, I will not deny them that. 3,000 years is a long time to carry the wrong story." As we prepared to leave, Margaret walked us to the door, her dog trotting along beside her once again, tail wagging lazily, as if nothing about the entire encounter had disturbed its afternoon in the slightest. At the doorway, she paused, studying each of us carefully, before finally speaking again. "Tell your people something for me," she said quietly. "Tell them that whatever they feared all these years was never really about me. It was about the idea that someone might exist who simply refuses to stop, no matter the cost. That fear says far more about what your people believe strength requires than it does about anything I actually did." I nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words, knowing they would echo through council chambers and history archives for generations to come. "Thank you," I said sincerely, "for speaking with us, for trusting us enough to share the truth." Margaret offered a small, knowing smile. "You crossed the galaxy to find me," she said. "The least I could do was sit down and finally set the story straight." As we made our way back across the quiet field toward our waiting shuttle, I glanced back once more at the small farmhouse standing peacefully beneath the golden afternoon sky, at the tire swing swaying gently in the breeze, at the old dog now curled up contentedly near the porch steps. 3,000 years of fear, built entirely around a woman who simply refused to give up, and who, when finally found, chose nothing more dramatic than sitting down and offering us tea. I boarded the shuttle in silence, my mind already racing ahead toward the conversation that awaited aboard the flagship, toward the countless questions the full council would undoubtedly have, and toward the slow, difficult process of rewriting a legend that had shaped my people's entire understanding of fear and strength for longer than any of us could properly remember. As the shuttle lifted off, carrying us back toward the waiting fleet above, I looked down one final time at the small blue world below, at the quiet farmhouse growing smaller in the distance, and felt something settle quietly within me. We had crossed the galaxy searching for a legend. We were returning home instead with something far more valuable: the truth. The council chamber was silent when I finally stood before them, the full recording of our conversation with Margaret already playing on the massive display behind me. I watched the faces of dozens of high-ranking officials as they listened to her voice for the first time, watched their expressions shift slowly from tense anticipation to something closer to quiet disbelief. General Kesh sat near the front of the chamber, his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the recording with an intensity that made it difficult to read exactly what he was thinking. When the footage finally ended, the room remained silent for a long moment, nobody quite willing to be the first to speak. "That is everything?" someone finally asked from the back of the room. "That is the being our entire civilization has feared for 3,000 years? "That is her," I confirmed, in her own words. Elira stepped forward beside me, carrying a stack of notes she had compiled during the short journey back to the flagship. "The account she gave us matches nothing in our archived records," she said, addressing the room directly. "Every historical text we possess describes overwhelming power, devastating force, a being capable of ending wars through sheer strength alone. What we witnessed today was something entirely different." "Explain," General Kesh said quietly. Elira glanced toward me briefly before continuing. "She did not defeat the enemy through power," she said. "She endured. She simply refused to stop, long after everyone else, on both sides of that conflict, had already given up hope of victory. The war ended because the opposing forces ran out of reasons to continue fighting against someone who would not surrender, not because she overwhelmed them." A murmur spread through the chamber, officials leaning toward one another, exchanging quiet, uncertain conversations. I could see the discomfort settling across the room, the slow realization that everything they had built their careers around, every protocol rehearsed, every weapon locked away in preparation, had been constructed around a story that had grown far beyond the truth it was meant to represent. 3,000 years, General Kesh said finally, his voice low. 3,000 years of fear, built around a story nobody ever bothered to verify. With respect, sir, I said carefully, I do not think anyone intended to build a false legend. I believe the truth simply became harder to carry than the myth. It is easier to fear an unstoppable force than to admit that the real lesson was something far more difficult to accept. The room fell quiet again as my words settled over the gathered officials. I glanced around at the faces surrounding me, historians who had spent entire careers studying fragments of a war none of them fully understood, generals who had trained their entire lives to prepare for a threat that, in the end, had simply been an old woman tending a quiet garden. What do we do now? One of the younger officials asked, her voice uncertain. General Kesh was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. We begin by telling the truth, he said. Every record, every teaching, every warning, passed down through generations will need to be corrected. It will not happen quickly. 3,000 years of belief does not unravel in a single afternoon, but it must begin somewhere. Over the following weeks, I watched as the fleet slowly began to withdraw from orbit above Margaret's quiet little world, ship by ship returning to their assigned stations across a dozen systems. The massive gathering that had once filled the sky above her farmhouse dwindled steadily until only a small handful of vessels remained, tasked with maintaining respectful contact rather than looming threat. I visited her one final time before returning to my own duties, walking once again across that same wide field, though this time without the weight of fear pressing down on my chest. She was sitting on her porch when I arrived, the same dog curled up lazily beside her, watching me approach with mild, familiar curiosity. "Come to check on the old woman who ended a war?" she asked with a small, knowing smile as I climbed the porch steps. "Something like that," I admitted, lowering myself into the empty chair beside her. "How did your council take the truth?" she asked. I considered the question carefully before answering. "Better than I expected," I said. "Worse than I hoped. Change like this does not happen overnight, but I believe it has begun." Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze drifting out toward the quiet field stretching before us, golden in the late afternoon light. "That is all anyone can really ask for," she said. "A beginning." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun drift slowly lower in the sky, the same tire swing swaying gently in the breeze exactly as it had the first day I arrived. I found myself thinking about everything that had led to this moment, about the fear that had shaped my entire life, about the legend that had turned out to be so much smaller, and yet somehow so much more meaningful, than anything our stories had described. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. "Of course." "Do you regret it?" I asked. "The war. Everything it cost you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she considered the question. "Every single day," she said honestly. "I lost people I loved. I carry memories I wish I could set down but never will. If given the choice, I would have preferred a life without any of it." "Then why continue?" I asked. "Why not simply walk away, the way so many others did?" She turned to look at me then, her eyes carrying the weight of everything she had lived through, softened only slightly by the quiet peace she had built for herself in the years since. "Because walking away would not have made any of it stop hurting," she said. "It would only have meant more people suffered the same way I already was. I decided early on that if I was going to carry that pain regardless, I would rather carry it while still trying to make things better than carry it while doing nothing at all." Her words settled deeply into my chest, heavier than anything I had learned during my entire career as a scout. I thought about the countless briefings, the emergency protocols, the weapons hidden away for generations, all built around fear of overwhelming power. None of it had prepared me for the quiet, simple truth sitting beside me on that porch. "I think," I said slowly, "our people feared the wrong thing all along." Margaret smiled faintly, reaching down to scratch gently behind her dog's ears. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps they feared exactly the right thing. They simply misunderstood what it actually was." Before I left that evening, she pressed a small, worn thermos into my hands, insisting I take it for the journey ahead. "For the trip," she said simply, waving off my attempt to politely decline. "Something warm to remind you that not everything worth fearing is dangerous, and not everything dangerous is worth fearing." I carried that thermos back to my ship, back through the quiet field one final time, past the fence, past the tire swing, past the small farmhouse that had somehow reshaped the entire foundation of my people's history in the span of a single afternoon. Months passed after that visit, and slowly, carefully, our historians began the long process of rewriting 3,000 years of doctrine. New records replaced old ones. New teachings began emphasizing perseverance over raw power. resilience over dominance, the quiet strength of refusing to give up, rather than the terrifying image of an unstoppable force. It was not an easy transition. Many still struggled to fully release the fear they had carried their entire lives, fear passed down from parents and grandparents who had never questioned the stories they were taught. But it was a beginning. I returned to my duties as a scout, continuing to explore the quiet corners of the galaxy, though I carried something different with me now, something heavier and lighter all at once. I kept Margaret's thermos on my console, a small, worn reminder of everything I had learned that single afternoon on her porch. Sometimes, late at night, drifting quietly through empty space between distant stars, I would think about her sitting calmly beneath that tree, patting the empty space on the bench beside her, completely unbothered by the armada gathered above her home. I would think about the fear my people had carried for 3,000 years, built not around strength but around the simple, uncomfortable truth that some things refuse to stop, no matter what stands in their way. We had crossed the galaxy searching for a legend capable of ending wars through overwhelming power. We found instead a tired old woman with a quiet garden, a loyal dog, and a truth far more valuable than any weapon our people had ever built. She did not need to prove her strength to us. She simply sat down, offered us tea, and reminded an entire civilization that the greatest battles are rarely won through power alone. They are won by those who refuse, quietly and stubbornly, to ever truly give up. And somewhere on that small, unremarkable blue world, beneath the shade of an old tree, I imagine she is still sitting there today, watching the sunset stretch slowly across her quiet field, completely at peace with a truth the rest of the galaxy had taken 3,000 years to finally understand.